Welcome back to Books on the Mic. We are on Chapter 4 now. Don't forget to subscribe if you're enjoying these deep dives. We want to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. So today we're going to be cracking open Richard Rumelt's Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And let me tell you, this is not your typical, boring business book. Rumelt is sharp, he's witty, and he's got this great way of breaking down what actually makes a strategy work.
Yeah, you know what's so interesting about Rumelt is that he actually starts off with a historical example to illustrate this whole idea of strategic thinking. He takes us all the way back to the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805.
Oh yeah, the one where British Admiral Lord Nelson totally pulled off this incredible victory. He was completely outnumbered facing a combined French and Spanish fleet.
Yeah.
Most people thought he was going to stick with the traditional line of battle tactics, but he had something else in mind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Nelson completely threw out the playbook. He divided his fleet into these two columns and drove them straight into that enemy line. And I mean, this was a huge gamble, but it was a calculated risk based on his understanding of the situation.
So it wasn't just about being brave or aggressive. It was about seeing the battlefield differently than everyone else and then coming up with a plan that really played to his strengths and exploited the weaknesses of his enemies.
Exactly. And the impact was massive. This decisive victory at Trafalgar really secured British naval dominance for over a century.
Wow, talk about long-term payoff.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've seen how strategic thinking can play out in a historical military context, but how does that translate to the business world today?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Rumelt argues that a lot of companies today confuse strategy with other things, like having ambitious goals or strong leadership or even detailed plans. But he makes a really strong point that these things, while important, they don't actually equal a good strategy.
That's like having all the ingredients for a cake, but no recipe to put it all together.
Precisely a good strategy. It's more than just a wish list of things you want to achieve. It's actually a path to overcoming a very specific challenge. And he uses this cautionary tale of Lehman Brothers' downfall back in 2008 to illustrate this.
Yeah, that was a big one for the entire financial system. So what was Lehman's so-called strategy?
Well, their strategy was basically to grow faster than their competitors, no matter the cost. They took on massive amounts of risk betting big on the housing market, and they didn't really have a solid plan for, dealing with a potential downturn.
So it was like they were saying, we're going to win because we're going to gamble more than anyone else.
Yeah, exactly. Ambition without substance, and we saw the consequences not just for Lehman, but for the entire global economy.
Okay, so we've got one historical example of good strategy, and then we've got a modern example of what not to do. Can we dive into a company that successfully turned things around with a good strategy?
Absolutely. Rumelt uses Apple's remarkable comeback under Steve Jobs in the late 1990s as the prime example. When Jobs came back to Apple, the company was on life support. And his initial strategy was all about survival scaling back operations, focusing on a niche market.
That's so interesting because you think of Jobs and you think revolutionary products, and this whole thing starts with getting back to basics.
Exactly. It might seem counterintuitive, but that survival strategy was crucial. It allowed Apple to kind of stabilize, regain their focus, and buy some time to develop that longer-term plan.
So it was about getting the company healthy enough to take on those bigger challenges down the line.
Right, and Jobs had this much more ambitious vision waiting in the wings, one that would ultimately redefine Apple and really the whole tech industry as we know it.
So this was all about getting a solid foundation in place before you can build that skyscraper. Speaking of building, Tiro, Rumelt introduces this concept of a guiding policy as a really crucial element of a good strategy. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. A guiding policy, you can think of it almost like a compass for your strategy. It's a very clear statement that can really help you navigate complex situations and make effective decisions. So, Rumelt gives this really simple example of a woman named Stephanie who runs a corner grocery store. She's constantly having to make decisions about, pricing and stocking shelves and managing staff, all these different things. And so a guiding policy really helps her to prioritize and make the choices that align with her overall goals.
So instead of reacting to every little fire that pops up, she has this framework for making consistent, informed decisions.
Exactly. Now, Rumelt contrasts this with companies that try to just brute force their way to success, through sheer motivation or what he calls push. I think he talks about working with this one company that was obsessed with growth, but their strategy was just, a bunch of buzzwords and motivational slogans.
So they had the energy, but no direction to channel it.
Exactly. You need more than just, effort. You need a clear path and the right tools to get where you want to go.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have this guiding policy in place. But then how do you actually set strategic objectives that are going to move you towards those goals?
Hmm.
Because this is where I think a lot of companies get lost in that pie-in-the-sky thinking.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of companies fall into this trap of setting these vague, aspirational goals. Things that sound good on paper, but they lack substance. And Rumelt calls these blue sky objectives, things like, we want to be the world's leading innovator. But what does that actually mean?
It's like saying, I want to be happy. It's a nice sentiment, but it doesn't really give you a roadmap to get there.
Exactly. A good strategy translates those lofty aspirations into specific, measurable, achievable objectives.
So how do you avoid getting lost in the blue sky?
Well, Rumelt uses this example of a plan by the Los Angeles School District to improve test scores. And their objective was so broad and so difficult to measure that it ended up being just as challenging as the original problem. He argues that strategic objectives should be like stepping stones, clear, attainable, each one leading you closer to that ultimate goal.
Okay, I'm seeing how you really break down those big, vague goals into smaller, more actionable steps. And this brings us to something Rumelt calls the kernel of good strategy. That sounds pretty important. What is that?
Kernel of good strategy is really the core, DNA of a successful plan.
Yep.
And it has three essential components. You've got the diagnosis of the problem, you've got this guiding policy for how you're going to deal with it, and then you've got this set of coherent actions that are designed to carry out that policy.
So you have to understand the challenge. Then you need that guiding principle to direct your efforts. And then you need to take specific actions that align with that principle. Sounds simple in theory.
Right, but much harder to execute in the real world.
Exactly.
But it gives you this really powerful framework for developing a strategy that's more than just a wish list or some vague set of aspirations.
Okay, can you give us an example of how this kernel actually plays out in a successful strategy?
Sure. Rumelt points to the 1991 Gulf War as a prime example. General Norman Schwarzkopf's left hook strategy was a brilliant illustration of the kernel in action.
Okay, I vaguely remember that from history class. That was a pretty quick victory, wasn't it, for the coalition forces?
Yeah, it was a stunningly swift and decisive victory. And Schwarzkopf's strategy involved a very deep understanding of the Iraqi army's weaknesses, a clear guiding policy focused on outmaneuvering them, and a series of these meticulously coordinated actions that ultimately led to their collapse.
So he didn't just, throw troops at the problem. He had a clear diagnosis, a guiding principle, and a set of actions that work together seamlessly.
Exactly, and that's what separates a good strategy from just, hoping for the best or throwing resources at a problem and seeing what sticks.
This makes me think back to that company you mentioned earlier, the one that was all about bandwidth connectivity. But they didn't have a real plan for getting there. They were missing that kernel, that core strategic thinking.
They had the buzzwords, but not the substance.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I'm starting to see how powerful this concept of the kernel can be. But let's shift gears a little bit and talk about focus. It seems like a pretty basic idea, but Rumelt makes a compelling case for its importance in developing a good strategy. What's his take on it?
Well, he uses this really interesting case study of crown, cork, and seal to illustrate how a laser-like focus can really be a game changer. Now, Crown, Cork, and Seal is a can company, not exactly the most glamorous industry. But that's what makes their story so interesting. They didn't try to be everything to everyone. They really focused on this very specific niche, providing short runs of specialized cans to small and medium-sized businesses.
So they found their lane and they stayed in it, rather than trying to compete with the bigger players in the mass market.
Exactly, and they had this seemingly simple set of guiding policies, providing exceptional technical assistance to their customers, guaranteeing rapid order fulfillment, and then building smaller, more flexible plants that could handle those short runs really efficiently. And these policies, while they might seem kind of mundane, actually created a very powerful strategic advantage. It allowed them to really outmaneuver their larger, less nimble rivals.
So these seemingly simple policies were actually kind of their secret weapon. They turned what seemed like limitations into strengths.
Precisely. They understood their strengths, they understood their target market, they understood the competitive landscape, and they crafted a strategy that really capitalized on all of those factors.
So it wasn't about being flashy or innovative. It was about being really, really good at what they chose to focus on.
Exactly. And I think it's a powerful reminder that focus can be a really potent source of competitive advantage. It's about choosing your battles wisely and directing your energy and your resources where they're going to have the biggest impact.
Okay, I'm really starting to appreciate the power of focus. It's not just about being good at something, it's about choosing where to direct your energy and resources. saying no to those distractions and opportunities that don't align with your core strengths.
Absolutely. And this ties into another important point that Rumelt makes: growth should be a means to an end, not an end in itself.
Because so many companies get obsessed with growth, even if it means, sacrificing profitability or strategic coherence. It's like this belief that bigger is always better, regardless of the cost.
Right. And Rumel really challenges that assumption. He uses the example of Crown Cork and Seal's later history to illustrate the dangers of pursuing growth for growth's sake. So after a change in leadership, the company embarked on this aggressive acquisition spree.
So they start buying up other companies, presumably to expand their market share and boost their revenue.
Yeah, but the acquisitions weren't driven by a clear strategic rationale. They were just buying companies to get bigger without really considering whether those companies fit into their overall strategy.
So they were gaining size, but losing focus.
Exactly. And the results were predictable. Crown Cork and Seal's profits plummeted even as their sales were going through the roof.
That's a cautionary tale if I've ever heard one.
It is. It's a reminder that growth should really be a consequence of a sound strategy, not the goal in and of itself. You need a clear rationale for why you're expanding and a plan for how those acquisitions are going to contribute to your overall success.
Okay, so we need to be strategic about growth, just like every other aspect of the business.
Exactly. And that leads us nicely into the concept of competitive advantage,
Yeah.
which Rumelt builds on the work of Michael Porter.
Porter's 5 forces, right? That framework for analyzing the competitive forces within an industry.
Yeah. And Rumelt emphasizes that competitive advantage is about creating more value than your competitors. It's not just about being profitable, it's about being more profitable or more efficient than the other players in the game.
So you need to have something that sets you apart, something that gives you an edge that others can't easily replicate.
Right, he uses eBay as an example. They might not have the highest profit margins in the world, but their platform and their network effects create this really powerful competitive advantage that's incredibly difficult to replicate.
Yeah, because their early dominance came from creating this marketplace where buyers and sellers could connect in a way that just wasn't possible before.
Yeah.
And as more people used it, the more valuable it became.
Exactly. That's a great example of what Rumelt calls isolating mechanisms. So these are the factors that really protect and sustain a company's competitive advantage. It could be patents, brand recognition, unique skills or technology network effects, or even just a deep understanding of a particular market.
So it's like building a moat around your castle to make it harder for competitors to attack.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. It's not just about wanting to succeed. You need this clear understanding of your strengths, your weaknesses, your competition, the forces at play in your industry.
Right.
And then you need a way to translate that understanding into a set of concrete actions that are going to move you towards your goals.
And that's the essence of good strategy.
Okay, this is all really insightful stuff. But how do you actually create value? How do you turn that competitive advantage into tangible results?
So Rumelt outlines 4 main ways that companies can create value and boost their competitive advantage. First, they can deepen their existing advantages, making what they already do well even better. Second, they can broaden the extent of those advantages, applying them to new markets or new products. Third, they can create higher demand for what they offer, maybe through innovative marketing or developing new desirable features. And finally, they can strengthen those isolating mechanisms that we were talking about earlier, building higher walls around their competitive moat.
So it's not a one-and-done deal. You have to constantly be working on refining your strategy, finding new ways to create value, and stay ahead of the competition.
Exactly. And Rumelt really emphasizes this idea of recognizing and exploiting what he calls waves of change. These are those big shifts in technology or customer behavior or market dynamics that can completely reshape entire industries. He uses the example of Cisco systems. They rode the wave of the internet boom back in the 1990s to become this dominant force in networking equipment.
They were in the right place at the right time. But they also had the foresight to seize the opportunity. What did they do that set them apart?
Well, Cisco recognized the transformative power of the internet really early on. They understood that this new technology was going to require a massive investment in networking infrastructure. And they were really aggressive about acquiring companies that had these complementary technologies and skills, which allowed them to really rapidly expand their product offerings and their market reach.
So they weren't afraid to make bold moves and adapt quickly to a changing landscape. But their success wasn't just about luck or timing. They had a strategy in place that allowed them to really capitalize on those shifts.
Right. They recognized the wave, they understood the implications, and they took decisive action to ride it to success. But a lot of companies either fail to see those waves coming or they underestimate their impact.
And this makes me think about all the predictable biases that Rumelt talks about. These are the mental shortcuts that can really blind us to opportunities or lead us to make bad decisions. It's like we're looking at the world through a distorted lens.
Yeah, he's spot on about those biases. We tend to underestimate the speed and impact of change. We cling to the status quo, assuming that things will continue to operate as they always have.
It's the classic innovator's dilemma. The companies that are most successful in the current market are often the ones that struggle the most to adapt to disruptive innovations.
Right. And then we get caught up in this hype of the battle of the titans, focusing on the big established players and failing to see the rise of these new entrants that are playing by a different set of rules.
It's like that old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Companies get comfortable with their success, and they're reluctant to change, even when the world around them is shifting dramatically.
Yeah, and this leads us to another really crucial aspect of Rumelt's approach to strategy. He sees it as this kind of scientific inquiry.
Okay, I like that. How does science fit into the world of business strategy?
Well, Rumelt argues that developing a good strategy is kind of like developing a solid scientific hypothesis. You start with an observation, you formulate a hypothesis about what might work, and then you test it through experimentation.
So in the business world, the hypothesis is your strategy, and the experiment is putting it into action, seeing how it plays out in the marketplace.
Exactly. And just like in science, you have to be willing to collect data, analyze the results, and adjust your approach based on what you learn. Successful strategists embrace uncertainty. They know that they can't predict the future with perfect accuracy.
So it's not about having all the answers up front. It's about being flexible and adaptable, willing to learn and iterate along the way.
Precisely. They treat their strategies as hypotheses, not rigid doctrines. And this ties back to what we were discussing earlier about recognizing and exploiting those waves of change.
Right. If you're stuck in a rigid mindset, you're less likely to see those waves coming or to adapt to them effectively.
Exactly. And Rumelt talks about this idea of identifying anomalies. These are the bits of information that don't quite fit with the prevailing wisdom. They can be early warning signs of a shift in the market or a clue that a commonly held belief is actually wrong.
It's like that saying, the exception proves the rule. Sometimes the most valuable insights come from paying attention to the things that don't quite fit.
Right. And Rumelt uses the story of Howard Schultz and Starbucks to illustrate this point.
Ah, yes, the guy who turned a tiny coffee bean company into this global empire. What's the anomaly in the Starbucks story?
Well, back in the early 1980s, everyone thought Schultz was crazy for trying to bring these Italian-style espresso bars to America. Coffee was seen as this cheap commodity, something you drank at home or in a diner. But Schultz saw something different. He saw an opportunity to create this third place, between work and home, a place where people could connect and enjoy a more premium coffee experience.
So he saw this gap in the market, a need that wasn't being met. And he had the vision and the courage to go against the grain, even when everyone else thought he was nuts.
Exactly. And that's what separates the truly successful strategists from the rest. They're not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom, to see the world differently, and to pursue opportunities that others might overlook.
So we need to be on the lookout for those anomalies, those glimpses of something new and different. But how do we know which ones are worth pursuing? There must be tons of data points that don't fit neatly into our existing models.
Yeah. That's where judgment comes in. A good strategist needs to be able to sift through all the noise and identify the signals that really matter. Be able to connect the dots, see the patterns that others might miss, and make informed decisions based on incomplete information.
So it's not just about being analytical. It's about being perceptive and intuitive as well.
Exactly. It's about having this well-calibrated gut feeling that's informed by experience and knowledge and a deep understanding of your field.
And Rumelt talks about building this mental model of your industry. It's almost like having a panel of experts in your mind that you can consult with.
Right. And this panel experts could include people you've worked with, authors you've read, historical figures whose insights you admire. The key is to have a diverse set of perspectives to draw on when you're trying to make sense of a complex situation.
It's like having your own personal board of advisors that you can bounce ideas off of.
Exactly, and it helps you avoid the trap of groupthink, where everyone starts thinking alike and nobody is willing to challenge the prevailing assumptions.
Yeah, that's so important, especially in today's world where we're just bombarded with information. It's so easy to get swept up in the latest trends or fads.
Right, you have to be able to think for yourself, to question those assumptions, and to be willing to go against the grain when you see something that doesn't make sense.
And Rumelt uses that example of the 2008 financial crisis to illustrate this. So many smart people got caught up in the hype of the housing bubble, ignoring the warning signs because everyone else was doing the same thing.
Right, they were all looking at the same data, making the same assumptions, coming to the same flawed conclusions.
It's a reminder that even the brightest minds can be susceptible to groupthink and herd mentality.
Right, and Rumit really stresses the importance of independent thinking, of being willing to stand apart from the crowd when you see something that others are missing.
He uses the example of Global Crossing, that company that laid all those fiber optic cables across the Atlantic Ocean back during the dot-com boom. Everyone thought they were brilliant, but Rumelt saw that the fundamentals of the business were really shaky.
Right. He did a simple 5 forces analysis and realized that the industry was ripe for a price war. It was a classic commodity business, low barriers to entry. There was no way Global Crossing could maintain those sky-high valuations.
And of course he was right. The bubble burst, Global Crossing went bankrupt, and a lot of investors lost a lot of money.
It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest analysis can be the most powerful, and that we need to be very wary of following the crowd, especially when things seem too good to be true.
This brings us to another important concept that Rumelt explores, this idea of the inside view versus the outside view. What's the difference?
So the inside view is our natural tendency to see ourselves and our situations as unique. We think we're special, the rules don't apply to us. The outside view takes a more objective perspective. It looks at historical patterns, statistical data, these base rates to make more informed judgments.
So, for example, if I'm opening a new restaurant, I might think, of course I'm going to succeed. I have a great concept, a fantastic location, and a killer chef. But statistically, most new restaurants fail. That's the outside view talking.
Exactly. And the inside view can be really dangerous. It can lead us to underestimate risks and overestimate our chances of success. The outside view helps us to be more realistic to see our situation in the context of broader trends and patterns.
And Rumelt uses the example of the housing bubble to illustrate this. Everyone thought the housing market would just keep going up forever. They had all these reasons why. This time it's different.
Right, but if they'd taken a more objective outside view, they would have seen that real estate bubbles have a long history of bursting.
And they might have been more cautious about taking on so much debt.
Exactly. The financial crisis was a painful reminder that we need to be aware of our own biases and this tendency to see the world through rose-colored glasses.
Okay, so how do we shift from that inside view to the outside view? How do we become more objective in our assessments?
Well, it starts with recognizing that we're all susceptible to these biases. We need to actively seek out data and perspectives that challenge our assumptions. We need to be willing to be wrong to adjust our beliefs in light of new evidence.
So it's about being humble,
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that we don't have all the answers, and being open to learning from others.
Exactly. It's a lifelong process of self-awareness, critical thinking, and intellectual humility.
Okay, this has been a really thought-provoking discussion. I'm starting to see how much our own biases and mental models shape our perception of the world, and how important it is to be aware of those biases when we're making strategic decisions.
Right. Rumelt's book is a really powerful reminder that good strategy is not about following the crowd or chasing the latest fads. It's about making clear-headed decisions based on a deep understanding of the situation and a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've talked about the science of strategy, the importance of identifying anomalies, the dangers of the inside view, the need for independent thinking. I'm feeling like I have a much better grasp of what it actually takes to craft a good strategy, but I'm also feeling a little overwhelmed by all this information. I hear you. Ruma's book is dense. There are a lot of insights and examples in there. It's a lot to absorb. But I think the key takeaway is that good strategy is not about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions. It feels like we're starting to see these common threads, these patterns that weave through all of Rumelt's examples of good strategy.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a pattern there. It's about taking this clear-eyed view of the challenges, really understanding the forces at play and having the discipline to focus on what truly matters.
And not being afraid to forge your own path, to question that conventional wisdom to say, hey, I see things differently.
That's really what distinguishes those great strategists. They're not just reacting to the world around them, they're actively shaping it.
It's inspiring, but also a little intimidating. It takes guts and conviction to stand up and say, I see things differently.
It does, but I think Rumelt's book really provides a framework for developing that kind of strategic thinking. It's not about having all the answers, it's about knowing which questions to ask.
And being willing to experiment,
Right.
to learn from your mistakes and to adapt to those ever-changing circumstances.
Exactly. He uses the example of TiVo, the company that pioneered digital video recording. They had this fantastic product, but they faced this uphill battle competing with the cable and satellite companies that really dominated that set-top box market.
Right. They were trying to go it alone in an environment where the most valuable asset was really that customer relationship. It's a classic example of a company that failed to understand the bigger ecosystem that they were operating in.
Yeah, they were so focused on building a better mousetrap. But they kind of overlooked the fact that people were already pretty content with their existing mousetraps, especially when those mousetraps were bundled with all these other services.
Right. It shows how important it is to consider the whole system, not just our little corner of it,
Yeah.
and to be open to collaborating with others, even those who we might traditionally think of as competitors.
And Rumelt highlights this idea of coherence, in a well-crafted strategy. All the elements need to work together. The actions, the resources, the policies, everything has to be aligned and coordinated.
He uses this great analogy of a chain. If one link is weak, the entire chain is vulnerable. And it's the
Yeah.
same with strategy. Every component needs to be strong and synchronized with the others.
Exactly. And it's not just about internal alignment. Your strategy has to be in sync with that external environment, with those competitive dynamics of your industry.
Rumelt brings up Hannibal's victory at the Battle of Cannae. This is like a masterclass in strategic coherence. Hannibal anticipated his opponent's moves, lured them into this carefully constructed trap, and then unleashed this devastating coordinated attack that crushed the Roman army.
Wow, that's a classic example of a smaller, less powerful force outmaneuvering a larger, stronger opponent through superior strategy. It really showcases the power of having that clear, cohesive plan.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense. We need to understand the challenge, identify the key dynamics, establish a guiding policy, and then design a series of coherent actions that are aligned with our goals and the competitive landscape.
Right. And we have to be willing to learn and adapt and refine our strategy based on that real-world feedback.
Rumelt's book has been like this roadmap, guiding us through the intricate world of strategy. It's given me this fresh perspective on the challenges I face and the decisions I make.
It's not a magic formula. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to every strategic problem. But I think it does provide a framework for sharper thinking, better decision-making, and ultimately achieving greater success.
Speaking of success, let's go back to Steve Jobs and Apple for a minute. We were talking earlier about that initial survival strategy when he came back to the company, but he had a much grander vision for Apple's future.
Oh, yeah. He saw this opportunity to create a digital hub, leveraging Apple's strengths in design and technology.
And this vision led to the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad. These were the products that propelled Apple to become one of the most valuable companies in the world.
Right. It's a brilliant example of a leader who really recognized and harnessed the power of those waves of change that we were talking about. Jobs saw this convergence of music computing and mobile technology, and he positioned Apple to ride that wave to extraordinary heights.
It's a powerful reminder that good strategy isn't just about staying afloat, It's about thriving. It's about creating something new, something valuable, something that can change the world.
Yeah, and it's about having the courage to pursue your vision even when others doubt you.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into good strategy, bad strategy. It's been a fascinating exploration, and I hope our listeners have found it as insightful and thought-provoking as we have.
Definitely. I encourage everyone to pick up the book and, really delve deeper into Rumelt's ideas. There's a wealth of wisdom there that can be applied to really any field or endeavor.
And before we wrap up, I want to leave you with this final thought from Rumelt. He says, a good strategy is a hypothesis about what will work. Not a dream, a slogan, a wish, a guideline, or a statement of ambition. So as you're navigating the world, keep your eyes peeled for those anomalies, those gaps in the market, those opportunities to create something new and valuable.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Think differently. And craft your own good strategy for success.
Thanks for joining us on Books on the Mic. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the world of ideas.
Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep strategizing